Greetings, salutations, and hello, I'm Tri. This time I will move my mouse further away from a box which held down a button, so I just spent a good amount of time rambling about the history of something and did not realize it was not recording. Yay me. On today's misadventure, thanks to that, we're going to talk about what is a CPU. And I will give you a nice history lesson for as best as I can. Now, I will warn you, I will ramble. If you've been following this, you've learned this already, so I'm not telling you anything new. I'm going to start you back in the days of what is the CPU. In essence, it is a bunch of sand melted with copper inside, placed on a kind of ceramic or plastic substrate with either pins or pads on the bottom, allowing your computer to compute. The central processing unit is actually what the term stands for, CPU. I guess if you go back far enough, you can thank Intel for the modern desktop CPU, which would have happened in the microcomputer, which is kind of the forerunner to what we use now. A computer back then was considered a mainframe. A mini computer was a smaller version that usually ran in the bank. They also had them in other locations, but they were still big-ass things you didn't take home. And then the microcomputer was, thank you, like IBM, Steve Jobs, and specifically Steve Wozniak. I shouldn't thank Jobs so much because he was a salesman. Wozniak, engineer. I, on the other hand, am a technician. Big difference is engineers build it, technicians fix the mistakes. That original Intel CPU was the 4004. And it was not fast. I think it was in the kilohertz. So let's skip forward a bit, because unless you're going retro computing, which is, I'll admit, it's an interest for me, but it's not where I'm going exactly with these videos yet. Maybe one day, and I do mean maybe. What I would intend would be to give you an idea of what CPUs are to the modern age. Sorry, that was itchy. I'm going to start with maybe where the concept of the naming comes from. I'll go back as far as, say, the 8086, which was the follow-up to the 40040. Well, actually, technically, we had the 80080, then the 8086, and the 8088. I'm not going to get too much into that one now, because I would have to go back and refresh because I don't remember entirely. One of them, I think, it was either a 4-bit or an 8-bit instruction set, and the other had the higher up. I think it was the 8088 had the higher, but it came up later on. By the time that you got to the 186, it was pretty much an 8-bit chip. Now, what do I mean by this? It's a series of instructions or instruction set. Complex instruction. I will have to look up the rest, unfortunately. Because there was the two sections. There was RISC, which was reduced instruction set code. There we go. Or complex instruction set code, which was your x86. There was a number of others. I'm not getting into those because Most of those are failed or discontinued. Again, retro stuff, might get into later. Now, of course, you have the naming scheme of 86. What is that? Well, that's the x86 architecture. You have the 8086, 8186, 8286, and yeah, it's 80186. Naming wise, we pretty much dropped the initial 80. So 186, 286, 386. I'm not going to go much back on this one because, well, we're not going to do too much of a history lesson here. I'm going to get into the stuff I truly know. Ooh, itchy. And this will start around the time of the 386, which we had two main variations, the SX and the DX. There was the SX was the sort of dumbed down. It was missing some features. The DX was the full feature chip. You would also have speeds rated in megahertz, which would be like million calculations per second, roughly. A hertz is basically on or off. It's a figure of binary, which I've mentioned before, which is your ones and zeros. So how many times it can calculate ones and zeros per second is your hertz rating. When you're up into the megahertz, you're up into the millions. When you're into the gigahertz range, you're into the billions. Sorry for you who are over in Europe and whatnot when it's the 1,000 million or something like that. I know there's the short count and the long count, and I think North America uses the shorter of the two. I'm not getting into a math thing either, because there's a certain point where I'm going to go, and by that point, we don't want to deal with me. I don't want to deal with me at that point. And I got to live with this guy. I will also point out, it's a warning for a reason. If the hair don't tell you, I'm old. I've got some stuff that's, I plug one ear, hope I can remember the rest that you're talking to me. Unfortunately, it ekes out. Okay, where was I? Yes. Where you had that initial bus speed, which was the same speed as the chip and the motherboard. This was originally configured by a little crystal that vibrated, and it vibrated at the frequency of what the chip was. Well, technically it was vibrating twice that. You would have a step down. So say you had a 40 megahertz vibrating chip or crystal, you would have a 20 megahertz chip. So DX20, you would have up to the 40 on the 386. Now you jump up to, there's a whole new socket and a way of plugging these things into the board, and unfortunately in the early days these weren't easy. If you want to upgrade, you required one of these suckers to pry it off, or you actually had the tool specific for, put it under, put it up, other side, same thing. Unfortunately, I do not have one of these. You tend to get them when you buy the boxed version of the CPU, and that was way back then. And back then, I did not have money. Back then, I was either single digits or teenage years. I don't frickin' believe it. Ugh. This is the second time I'm recording this. And it was in the earlier section I had a freaking email come in. Mental note. Mute the phone before I hit record. Lesson learned. As I was saying about the socket thing, there was two different types of 386. There was this weird push down socket that had the pins along the outside, which actually required a specific sort of, it looked like a pincer, and there was a notch on top, notch on bottom, or corners, and you could pick up the CPU from that. Or you had pins on the bottom and you had to force that sucker down. You made sure that your pins aligned because you smelt smoke. You could even release the magic blue smoke, and once you did that, usually your board and CPU were hosed. As I was trying to say, you go up to the 486 days. Now, you're still using that, like, I think it's 12 got dropped, but 20, 25, 33, and 44 front side bus, which is essentially it's the speed of the board and everything it connects to. I'm not going to get into the card slots because that's a different topic. I'm sticking with the CPU for now. But that front side bus is still important. Because with the advent of the 486, you went from the SX, which in this case, SX meant you did not have the math code processor built in. That required a separate chip called the 487, or the DX, which had that built in. I don't think that was the same on the 386, but don't hold me to that. On the DX side, and there was, I think, one SX where they introduced multipliers, which I believe was the SX50, so, or SX2-50. So, what's that name mean? It means you have a total speed of 50 megahertz created by a 25 megahertz frontside bus times 2. Like I said, the frontside bus is now important. Will be for quite a while, actually. And it was kind of sad when they got rid of that. However, I'm going to try and keep up with this. On the DX side, there was a 50. There was also a 66. There was an 80, but I believe that was only an AMD thing. If you want to correct me in the comments on that one, I'll let you. There was also a DX4. They never actually dealt with 3. Here's the funny part. Okay, if you're following the math, of course you have the times 2, and so you get 25 now becomes 50, 33 now becomes 66, 40 becomes 80, but you just hit that 100, and it's DX4. Here's the thing. It's not a 4. It's a 3. Somebody there can't do math, but this is so long ago. A good chunk of people who have seen this probably weren't born yet. This tells you anything? Well, this will tell you a lot to go with this, but I can remember quite a lot. It's mostly short term I have problems with. And that's what the ginkgo biloba is for. It helps if you remember to take it. But I'll leave other bad jokes for later on. That DX4100 and also DX120, which I believe that one was also an AMD only. Again, you can correct me in the comments, but I'm fairly sure of that one. It was 33 times 3 to get 100. Technically, it was 33.3 to get 99.9, which they rounded up to 100. So it wasn't really DX4100, it was DX3 99.9. Marketing, I guess, looked goofy. You go to that 120 on the other hand, and it's 3 times 40. 120. That math lines up. Good guy, AMD. You also, this became the end of that infamous, I believe it was socket 3, which had 2 variations. The earlier one was also that stupid, you've got pins on the bottom, and you have to press down on this plastic bit that goes around and has a series of holes that match up. You will tend to have a little arrow on it that'll have match an arrow on the motherboard. So when you put it down, all the holes line up with all the pins. Otherwise, you got that chance of releasing the magic blue smoke, which again, really bad, means you're out. At that time was thousands of dollars. As the retro community is going, give it time, it'll be back up there. I'm not bitter, not one bit. And I'm self-censoring, so there's your warning. Like I said, this was the end of a socket. Around this time, Intel was realizing, hey, we've been letting these guys use our patents, and specifically those who have licensed them. AMD was essentially your main guy who was allowed to do this, because originally Intel needed competition. You had you had Texas Instruments, you had Cyrex or Cyrix, take your pick how it's pronounced. You had a whole bunch of others. IBM did their own, and they were following the system for the x86 architecture, which was slowly evolving. And Intel said, I don't want you guys playing in my sandbox. So, by the time we get to 586, we've said goodbye to that first socket, or that 486 socket. Oh, sorry, it did have another version that was called ZIF, Zero Insertion Force. So, ZIF or ZIF. I'm Canadian. Get over it. Which had a little lever. So it pushed the socket off a little. You put the chip down. It slides in. It holds once you put the lever back down. It also had a couple of hooks on each side, so by this point you required fans. Ooh, God, there's a nasty thought. If I had a whole bunch of these, I'd been in another industry. Don't worry, I'm keeping clothes on. Okay, like I said, I'll save the bad jokes for later, but they will progressively get worse. I'm not apologizing. As I was saying, by the time we get to 586, Intel decided, okay, I'm going socket 5. I'm leaving you guys behind. I'm not sure if socket 4 was the ZIF socket, but I know I've read the ZIF sockets with socket 3 written on them, so I'm not sure what 4 was. But I'll be damn skippy, I knew what 5 was, because that was the original Pentium, which had your bus speeds of 30 and 33, so effective speeds of 60 and 66. They had a bug which was somewhat rectified, And they changed sockets again. They skipped over 6, unless there was a 6, and I haven't seen that one. And they went to 7. 7 was truly the last universal socket, because this is the last one that you had your 586, your 686, your Pentium and Pentium MMX. You also had on the AMD side your K5, K6, and such. Reason that the big issue was AMD didn't like the competition they had created. They had a whole bunch of people using their technology, which AMD was truly licensed to do and was brought in specifically to do. And Intel did some shady stuff using legal methods to try and scare people off, and a lot of companies just kind of went, meh, we're done. This is why you don't see as many of these CPU makers, because it was not worth fighting them, even though Intel was wrong. These people had licenses, but they tried to copyright numbers, and apparently you can't do that, at least not in the US. Or at least not at the time. I don't know if that still holds up. So, you still, on that socket 3, you had a 486 variant of Intel's, who they were still trying to do it so that, okay, you didn't have to quite move over, but they had like the 486 overdrive, which was kind of a DX 4100 sort of thing, and then the Pentium overdrive, which was putting a Pentium into a 486 socket. Didn't have the full oomph behind it, and if you benchmark the two side by side, the Pentium was faster, but only by a little bit. However, you had other people who were making stuff like the 586 from like Cyrix. You had what was known as the Evergreen chip, which I had one of these. They were great. And that's where the Mythical 4 came up. However, call this one funny. This is where, I don't know who does the numbering, but your AM 5X86 133 was actually 33 times 4. Yeah. Actually, it was 33.3 times 4, but you get the gist of it. But it was the 5th revision, so it was the 5X86. Yeah. Somebody still can't do math, and marketing on the CPU side very rarely makes sense. It's a really sad state of affairs. Now, I've already crossed 20 minutes, and I've only hit Pentium. So be prepared. Pause, go to the washroom, get yourself some popcorn. This may take a while. I could be rambling for a while. But it's all, what is a CPU? Now, as I was saying, Intel had problems with that original Pentium design, and they went to socket 7. So, you essentially had your 25 megahertz multiplier being the bottom end. And so you had the Pentium 75, which was 25 times 3. So, 75. On this socket, you had some boosting up. You now had a frontside bus that went 25, 33, 50, 75, 83.3. Yeah, that last one. Only, I think, a handful of chips really used it. It was rare. But you definitely got your speeds up as time went on. Your fastest Intel was the Pentium 233 MMX, which had a multimedia extension added on. You had your K5 and K6 with the PR rating, which was supposed to be the equivalent to the 486 variation, at least the performance rating. That's what they said. A lot of people believed it was the matching the performance of equal era Pentium. The MMXs eked out a little bit faster than that, but that's where you got the K6. Also having a performance rating, same kind of concept. So on K5, you went, I think it was 75, 100, 133, 166. K6 started with, I think it was 166, 200, 233, I think. And then you started hitting roadblocks. Well, around this time, Intel says, all right, we've had enough of you playing in our sandbox again. So, we're moving, and we're going socket 8. Hey, we actually went just a step. 7, 8. I love how this works. Finally, they make sense. I do not have one of these CPUs, unfortunately. I would love to, but the only CPUs that ever made it for socket 8 that I'm aware of was the Pentium Pro. This was the I'm here to do serious business chip. Yeah, it was the Sam the Eagle of Pentiums. If you're not familiar with the Muppet term, pause, go look up who Sam the Eagle is. That's a disservice if you don't know. You're all weirdos. That guy. It only had a handful of chips. But there was actually a Pentium Pro Overdrive, which got you like higher speeds. So you had your, I think it was on Pentium Pro, you had your 166, 200, 233. Don't think it went any higher than that, but I think the Overdrive went to 333. There's supposedly a mythical chip out there that did that too, but as far as I know, it is mythical. Unfortunately, a lot of other companies didn't move over to the new chip because it had some nightmare power regulation issues. Like, you actually required a daughter board power regulator, which is you have to slot on an additional card that controlled the power of your CPU. This actually started on the socket 7 and on the later Super 7. Now, yes, I'm going to hit that because I'm going to go back a bit. With the Super 7, the competitors to Intel stayed on, and they improved upon. So you get things like the K6-2, K6-3, your Cyrix, not so much, but I might stand corrected. I think they actually had a variation, which was their M2 and M3. Unfortunately, they don't go much past that. There is the Cyrix GX series, but that required a separate board entirely. It was specific chipset, specific to Cyrix. And then later on, they got bought by VIA. Your K62 also allowed, or K62, K63 allowed for, like, you had dual voltage and stuff like that. So this was a byproduct of the MMX era, where you had multiple voltages. So you had a voltage for the I/O and a voltage for the CPU. And you had what were called jumpers, which were a series of little pins that you had to arrange jumper caps. You're looking at my hand. I know you've been doing so. You see the extended nails. This is actually where that comes into play. I got tired of losing my pliers and losing tweezers when I'm trying to adjust the settings to the CPU. So I, instead of looking for a tool, became the tool. Shut up. I'm aware of what I said. Anyhow, I'm not going to get too much into the multiple voltage thing because it only held on for a certain amount of time. It got simpler with the K62 and K63 because they didn't do it as much. Whatever the listed CPU thing was, you found that on the... They actually put it as a little sticker section. On Intel, they put it underneath the chip. AMD was on, like, for example, this is an Intel, but it's the same idea. Metal shield here called the heat spreader, and they'd have it printed on here. Made it a whole lot easier to do because if you forgot your numbers and if short-term memory is shit, pick it up. Oh, that's what it was. AMD is right there on top. So until you put the cooler on, you have all your settings. But this was pretty much the end of the Super 7. They had a number of chips to work with this, and the retro community still loves that socket. I'm actually partial to it because one of my favorites was a K62 500 that was frickin' immortal. If you talk to most people, Windows ME causes people to shudder. My K62 500 did not ever crash when running Windows ME. It had one crash because I played with memory. Once I left that alone, it ran beautifully. It was immortal. You just couldn't do anything to it. And when a friend was going to college and I had upgraded, it was still usable. So to prevent it from going to e-waste, it was given to her. And to my understanding, it still ran for many years afterwards. I don't know what happened to it because I lost contact with that individual. If you happen to see this and you remember, let me know what actually happened to it. However, around this time, Intel said, okay, I had enough. The socket has to go. So, we get this monstrosity. The chip is now on a daughter board, which has a notch in it called a key. And there's now a slot instead of a socket. So you have a series that are like this for various cards. And now you have one more that's going this way for your CPU, and your RAM goes right in front, which actually has a nice little air effect, except the air has to go womp, womp, womp. So having the fan here actually cools things, like your RAM to a certain part. Cools the chipset, which is usually right here on the motherboard, right in front of the slot. On the back side is where you have your capacitors that have some problems. However, The Intel Slot 1 started with your Pentium 2, which, if you remember me talking about the Pentium MMX and the Pentium Pro, was the marriage of the two. They combined it into a single chip, and on the PCB added cache chips, so you could put more RAM, but it was slightly slower. You get to the Pentium 3, they improved upon it, and depending on the revision, which they had different types, I can't remember all the names, but there was like the Katmai, I think Deschutes was Pentium 2, Coppermine, which had two variations. There was the Slot, and then later, kind of the jokingly, Slocket, where they had a card that allowed you to, you put the data board into the slot, and now there's a socket on the side, so Slocket. And so you get to use things like, which I believe this one was a Coppermine, but they also had one that was, it has the cache chip integrated into the chip in the middle in a itty bitty little piece of melted sand and copper. Yeah, if you've ever seen level 1 techs, and they say it was a mistake teaching sand to think, there you go. The slot itself was kind of a novel approach to how to keep it to yourself. I can't remember what the pin count was, but AMD, being kind of a cocky bastard, said, okay, we won't use your design. They still used the same slot, but turned it 180 degrees and called it Slot A. So you take the same Intel processor, it'll fit that slot. Might not work, but it'll fit. Sneaky bastard AMD. I love the way they did that. This was around the time of the gigahertz race, where the Pentium 3 and the K7. Now remember that K designation? That stood for kryptonite. Go ahead and flame me in the comments. I know this one. The K5 was originally supposed to be Pentium's kryptonite. That's why it was K. You get to the K7 and it was called the Athlon. Now, this one, I don't know the name. But the Athlon was actually the first to reach 1 gigahertz. And this was without overclocking. It was actually the last, I believe it was the last chip to go to that slot. But 1 gigahertz. So it was either 1,000 that was created by 100 times 10, or the bus speed had actually increased. So you get the 133, which could be 133 times 7.5, would also give you pretty damn close to 1,000. But it was making it easier to get there. The faster you put the bus speed, the lower the multiplier has to be to achieve the speed. Same concept for overclocking, which was how you get more speed by bumping it up. I explained that. Did I explain that? Yes, I believe I did. That was the Celeron thing. That may have been in the other version of this video. Not exactly sure. That multiplier thing, overclocking, is you either bump up the frequency, which, okay, say your chip ran, example of the Celeron actually, 66 times, I think it was, if 3 was, should be times 9 to get 300. Well, if you go like 75 times 9, you get a higher value. I'm not going to do the math off on my head because I'm only so stable. Not to mention, I'm into my longest video ever at 40 minutes, and we're still on that era. That was actually still on the slot era too, but overclocking was a big thing previous, but there was also a voltage component where you had to bump that up to make the chip stable because it took more power to run at that, and you created more heat. That's why you ended up with fans and whatnot, is that the more voltage you pumped in, the more heat you created. Though it's funny that over time you started reducing the amount of voltage and increasing the amperage. That's another equation to deal with. That is your power equation. That wattage equals voltage times amps. I'm going to keep going on this one for now, but I did say my short-term memory is along with this. Low cache. Good memory. That'll be a later video. As the sockets continued, Intel started hitting kind of a wall with that 1 gigahertz thing. They didn't go much past 1 gig, and AMD didn't go much past 1 gig on the slot either. I don't know if this was a limitation to the slot, but they both returned to sockets, but they moved off to their own sockets. On Intel, you went the 370, and on AMD, you went socket A or 462. Now, 462 had a big range. It was actually a much larger range because from about the Athlon 750 on, and it started at 550, that kind of went back and forth between their own socket. And so you had the Athlon, which was your high end, and your Duron, which was the Celeron less cache. But they were smart enough to put enough cache on to make it actually mean something. So you could game and not have too many problems. Celeron, the original Celeron, they stripped it out completely. They learned their lesson. Celerons later on had cache, but there was a reduced amount. And so at a cheaper price, you could get the same speed, but you didn't get the same pull. If you think of it as racehorses, you have an Arabian, which is your full featured, has the full cache, versus I wish I knew horses better, but you have a starved horse trying to run as fast as the Arabian, and you know it's not happening. On the AMD side, they made a Clydesdale that ran as fast as that damn Arabian. So you often had like you have your Athlon 1 gig that was doing the workload of a Pentium 3 that was say 1.4 gig, which I think was their top. As they went on, they started increasing more features, of course, faster speeds, newer sockets, and then you went to Intel again. They love to change their socket. So they went socket 423, which was the initial NetBurst or Pentium 4. This used a funky type of RAM called RAM bus, and it was supposed to only use that. They modified a bit, and they also went to 478. And they started off with RAM bus, but they moved over to DDR, which was cheaper, not nearly as hot, lower voltage, surprisingly close in speeds, but didn't require as much. The chipset on the motherboard still controlled your memory, so on the AMD side, they went SD-RAM to DDR. So single data rate, so SDR, double data rate, so it means instead of just going up, it's up and down at the same time. So you get twice the data flow, so double data rate. This also affected the front side bus. So where you would have a 100 megahertz front side bus, the chip itself also had DDR, so it now effectively was 200 megahertz. You still only did the equation on the initial, so 1000 megahertz was 10 times 100 instead of 5 by 200. But you now went up to frontside buses, now actually went up to, I think it was 133, 166, and 200. So with the DDR, you now had, I think it was 266, 333, and 400. I love these advancements. On the AMD side, with the Athlons, this was a Barton core, which was the last revision of the Athlon XP, which was the last to use the socket A or 462. I have a lot of numbers in my head. Wow, this is going to be a long ass video. I'm almost at 50 minutes. I've only hit like the 2000s. In fact, this chip, I believe, was doesn't say on the chip. Oh, wait, yes it does. Was manufactured in 1999. Ow. Long time ago. I'm going to start skipping eras. Because, good lords. Yeah, this could take a while. Because Pentium 4 had a lot of revisions. And I'm not going to go through all of them. But they did a lot of the same things. Pentium 4 also, when they got to the DDR era, they started to essentially QDR, or quad data rate, on the CPU. So it would have an effective frontside bus of 400, but it was 100 times 4. And you continue the math as you go. You move on, and Intel kind of realized, like, by the time you got to the Pentium D, which was they essentially put two chips on the substrate, is this green section. It's basically either a plastic or silicon section where the CPU actually sits, and it connects and allows you to connect all the pins with circuitry on the bottom to help regulate. Actually, this would be a better idea of substrate silicon. Chip in the middle, plastic, but I think this was an organic package, but I don't know what it really was. Pins on the bottom, circuitry. You keep going, and Intel, with its love of changing sockets and whatnot, go to socket 775. And this is where your Pentium 4 will end. It went to die with the Pentium D and the Pentium Extreme, which was the higher version of the Pentium D, which had incorporated something called hyperthreading. So for every CPU die or core, it effectively acted as two cores. So threads is a doubling of cores. This was initially, it was supposed to be a way to sort of beat out AMD. If you double the cores, you don't have to run as fast. So because you're doing a higher workload. It's the same concept of when you're driving the horse and buggy, you add 2 horses, you now jump up to like 2 horsepower. I don't think it actually works that way, but you get the idea. Because AMD was sort of kicking their butts at that point. AMD jumps up to, the next one was the K8. The 754. This is where AMD really pulled a number on Intel. Because in the background, along with trying to increase their architecture and do new chipsets, the x86 instruction set was hitting a limitation, which was you could not exceed 4 gigs of RAM. This is why, like, the 32-bit world, which is where we're at, could only go to 4 gigs of RAM. That was the limitation. Intel was trying to do what was called IA64, which they implemented on a failed series of chips called Itanium, which was a partnership between them and HP, I believe, and didn't really go that far. AMD looked at it and went, we gotcha. The AM64 instruction set set the standard and was implemented on the Athlon 64, initially on that the 754. Now, on the previous generation, along with the advent of DDR RAM, you also had multi-channel RAM, known initially as dual channel, which essentially, I got one stick, I got one stick. It could parse it out kind of like that, so that it's doing double the load, but it's like one stick, one stick. It's not 2 sticks. So when you say, like, you have 1 gig of RAM, you have 512 times 2. That is really how dual channel works. When you get to 754, they went back to single channel because AMD really loved the memory. And on the 64-bit, you could go above 4 gigs of RAM. Granted, these sticks still didn't reach 4 gigs. That still took a little bit. On DDR1, the stick itself capped out at 1 gig. So you'd have to have 4 of those. And a lot of motherboards didn't have it. They had 3. You had the occasional gamer or workstation that had 4. So you could go up to 4 gigs of RAM. On the server or workstation side, that DDR could go to 2 gigs. I actually have that in my collection, but I'd have to dig it out. I might do that with when I finally tackle memory. Now, this was actually trumping poor Intel. The Pentium 4 could not keep up with the Athlon 64. They didn't have to run as fast as Intel did. And Intel actually hit some pretty impressive speeds. Like, I believe there was a 3.4 or 3.7 gig Pentium 4. I believe it was an Extreme Edition, but it was able to achieve some pretty impressive speeds. But AMD kind of went, okay, 2.2 gig. And I'm running circles around the Intel. Now, AMD only went with that for a couple of years because they also had a server side, which was I believe it was the 941, where they also had the code names. I'm actually going to use this because it comes up in what I'm saying. The code names for the 754 was Clawhammer, because they were hammering down AMD, I believe. Don't quote me on that. That's my own belief. And you had Sledgehammer on the more server and workstation side. And the FX series begins here. The initial FX, which I believe was the FX51, was the gaming chip at the time. And then the 53 still didn't match those gigahertz speeds. But performance was not all about gigahertz. Gigahertz was just a clock cycle. And if you could do more instructions per clock, that meant more. Unfortunately, Intel was learning. Along with the failure of Itanium, they branched off to another idea. And they went with the Core series, which started off the Core Solo and the Core Duo. So they learned their mistakes. On the AMD side, you had the Athlon 64, and then there was the X2. So they finally started doing their own dual core, but they hadn't done multi-threading, so you had true cores. Around this time, I actually had a Athlon 64 X2 3800 Plus, which ran at 2.2 gig. I often ran it at 2.4. It was an easy jump, and I didn't have to do much with the voltage to keep it stable. Pete Hubbard, yes, I went and bought another one of those boards after I moved to the US, because that was still to this day my favorite board. The Asus A8N SLI Premium. I have never met another board where I felt this was true advancement. It was also the first one to have 8 SATA ports. So, mute. phone, mute phone. Anyhow, up to an hour now. At least I'm on 64-bit architecture because we're still there. Currently, we're still there. I don't mean still there in the story, though both is true. This is around the time AMD did some stupid things, and Intel was learning. That Core 2 architecture, or Core 2 Duo, this is where things really got good. AMD decided to get into the world of competing in more fronts. So they bought a wonderful company out of Ontario, Canada, called ATI. They bought the graphics card company, which at the time was actually doing rather well. If you know the story, yeah, didn't go over well. Now, the Athlon 64, and later on they just called it the X2, because they stayed dual core for quite a while. The Core 2 Duo did the same thing, but the Core 2 Duo did it better. So when you got up to like the 5000 plus and whatnot of the X2s on AMD, it wasn't nearly as good. Now, you also had the Pentium dual core, which was now the Celeron, but it was a weaker Core 2. They also brought back the Celeron later on to sort of replace the Pentium dual core. Yeah, the socket 775 had a lot on it, which actually made people look at Intel going, hey, you finally kept a socket. Because this socket lasted a long time. It actually went up to the Core 2 Quad. So 4 CPUs on one chip, or 4 cores on one chip. My last setup while living in Canada was actually a Core 2 Quad, because I had issues with AMD's direction. When they came out with the Phenom or Phenom, however you want to pronounce that, it initially was kind of a flop. It was the first true 4-core CPU. But at the speeds they were going, 4 cores of Phenom could not match a dual core Core 2 Duo. Couldn't do it at equal speeds. And they were just... It actually felt like AMD had forgotten their customer base and decided to focus on 2 things at once when they were really good at one. But, well, time's a teacher. You keep going. The socket 775 kind of, they meet their end. They also go server side with 771. Not quite sure how more powerful chips have like 4 fewer pins or 4 contacts, because 775 did something weird. Do I have one? Yes, I do. Notice something different about this chip versus the ones I've showed earlier. No pins. The pins are now in the socket, which is called Land Grid Array, or LGA. The pins on the chip is the Pin Grid Array, or PGA. AMD maintained that for quite a long time. Now, Intel loves their numbers. So they decide to go for socket 1366. Nehalem. Oh, this was the big boy. When you're doing a 4-core, 8-thread, and you've got 12 megs of cache, your gaming glory, you're also production glory, because you are the master here. You dominate. You take that Core 2 Duo and you chewed it up, spit it out, and went, I've had better. AMD couldn't compete. No. And to make things worse, along with Nehalem, you had your Core i7. And then you had your lower Core i3, Core i7, Core i5. I believe Celeron was in there as well, but not so much. But you had LGA 1155, 1155 pins, along with your 1366, so 1366 pins. Eep. And of course, that's all in the socket. I will warn you, LGA makes the pins fragile in the socket. See, you can swap that out only so many times as you're careful. But you drop that CPU, you could ruin a very expensive board. Especially if it hits the socket, because now you gotta try and bend that back if it didn't break. But the gains, the gains were unreal. This is like, I had already gone, I went Core 2 Duo first and then Core 2 Quad. Intel had it, AMD didn't. And this was sad when I was an AMD fanboy. I admitted defeat. However, then you get AM2, AM3. At this point, Phenom kind of went down. It was a great idea, great concept. It did the high core count first. In fact, it did 4 cores first, and then the second revision, they did 6 cores. Unfortunately, on AM3 Plus, we had a problem on AMD, and this actually was where court cases, class action suit was done against AMD, because what was a core? They started putting what was called modules on chips, and each module had 2 cores. Now, I hate to tell you, this was more like core and thread. So you had the FX series again, and this was a blight on the FX series. There was another variation where they did the FX, but it was on server hardware, and I'm not going to go there. And much like that was an irritation, because to do a quad core, you had to use 2 chips, and it didn't share the resources that good. Intel also tried this before leaving the Core 2 series, and they called it Skull Trail. It allowed you to put like 2. They were technically Xeons at this point, which were the higher power workstation. Not exactly overclockable, but if you had the X version, it was. However, yeah, that era, it ended. We're on to the DDR3 era, which doesn't mean like triple that. It just means revision 3. Um, Bulldozer, which was the FX series that really did AMD wrong. They were hot. They did not run nearly as good. They had double the bus speed, and at this point, it was no longer called frontside bus. It was called base clock, which was the same on both AMD and Intel. At this point, you only have really the two. The last time you saw VIA, it was on that socket 370, which was the C3 chip. I didn't deal with it, but it was a rare low power thing, so yeah, less said the better. Unless you were into power efficiency and doing stuff like that. But that's neither here nor there. At this point, you might as well consider there are two companies, AMD and Intel, and that is it. AMD is suffering big time. Their acquisition of ATI, it wasn't what they hoped for. Their graphics tanked a bit. Their CPUs tanked a lot. And Intel stagnated. That wonderful series of i7s and whatnot, specifically on the mainstream line. This was your 1150 something. The big boy area, which was a enthusiast platform, your 1366, which also 1366 was server as well. It's in packaging, and I'm not taking it out. But there's two 1366 Xeons in this package. These were like the Xeons, specifically the E variant. They were not overclockable, but they were powerful. Plus, that multi-threading means you effectively have an 8-core chip now. And revision 2 of 1366, Westmeyer, went up to 6 cores, 12 threads per CPU. Now, you Mac lovers, yeah, I haven't forgotten you guys. I've been mostly staying to the PC world, which is Windows and Linux at this point. But you Mac people out there, I haven't forgotten you. I know, like, there was the Power PC days, the G3, the G4, the G5, and then you went Intel too. You started off on the Power Mac with the 771, which was the server side. And I have one of those systems. Actually, I have two of them. Of the Power Mac. Damn, those things are hefty. Love the chamber design, but I don't like the idea that your CPU vents heat into the chamber where the RAM is, and it's using server RAM, and that sucker is hot. So it's hotter because you're pumping heat through there. But negate most of that. I realized that you were there for the 771 and the 1366. Both Nehalem and Westmeyer. I have a Nehalem based dual Nehalem based Power Mac 4,1 sitting on a shelf behind me. Well, behind it to the side. I also have a server board that's sitting in a box on top of said Mac that has dual Westmeyer chips. Foreshadowing? Maybe. If you're still awake at this point, I realize I've already crossed the hour 15. And I've only started with the i7s. And yeah, bulldozer. You have your FX, like the 4100s, 4300s, which are your 4-core, just straight. You have the 61, the 63 series, which is a supposed 6-core, but it's 3 modules. There was an issue back in the Phenom days and Athlon X4 days, or X3, X4 days, back when they actually made triple core chips, which were actually failed quad cores, but the 4th core was disabled, which could be re-enabled on some motherboards. Bulldozer learned a lesson. The core was there, or the module was there, but they lasered it off. So it didn't connect at all. It was there, but it was useless. It was a fashion statement. I have it. I don't need it. I can't use it anyway. Yeah. And then you have the 81, 83 series. The reason why I'm saying it as that is there was the 8300 series, 8100 series. So you had double zeros, but just stick with the series for now. I'm not going to get too much into that because it was all the same series and all AM3 or AM3 Plus. There were some AM3 sockets that accept them, but it was only like the 4100 series. Yeah. Which actually performed fairly decent compared to their bigger brothers. They were overclockable. In fact, my 83, my FX 8300, which had a standard clock speed of 3500, which was 200 times yada yada. You can do the math. I actually had it running at 4200. And I didn't have to play much with the voltage, but the voltage was already ridiculous. Where they were supposed to be like 1.2 volt, but they ran at 1.4. And so they required a fair amount of cooling. And they may have affected your power bill just a little bit. Yeah. You could hit higher speeds on Intel, drop the voltage down, and it still ran beautifully. But now you had multiple revisions. Like, you started off with Bloomberg, which was the initial, and I think it was also a Lindbergh as well. But then they went Sandy Bridge, and this is where a lot of improvements go. If you've ever heard of like the i7 2600K, this was a beautiful chip, and I have one of those. It's actually right next to that Power Mac 4 Combo 1. I worked at a wonderful place that when something got old enough, then you have the retro gamer and me going, "Bye!" To you headphone users, I'm sorry I just did that. Just realized you went, "Ah!" Oops. Anyway, back on topic. You keep following this age, Sandy Bridge, or your second generation, your Ivy Bridge, third generation, Haswell, fourth generation, and this is when you notice it's like your i7 4770 and stuff like that. The 4 is your generation. 7 denotes it's an i7. The following designation is where it exists in the hierarchy. The final being 0. Sometimes it's questionable if that has meaning or not. This concept comes up in AMD later on. But that gets into laptop stuff, and yeah, I won't go there because this could be a godly video at this point. Woohoo! And I thought I was rambling the first time I did this before I realized I didn't have the frickin' record button going. Anyway, we keep going, and Intel is got like 7% increase per generation. And it's a fairly stable 7%, 7%, 7%, 7%, 7%. Around the time of the i7, they also had a boost clock, which, if your CPU was under a certain speed, or under a certain temperature, I should say, and required a little more oomph, it could take a core at first, then a couple cores later on, and then a progression, and boost them up. So, say you had your core speed was like 2 gigahertz. It could boost one of those cores to 2.5 until the chip heated up enough, and then it brought it back down. This is where overclockers kind of saw that, hey, what the hell just happened? Also, your Core 2 Quad was the last time you saw a 400 megahertz, 1600 megahertz frontside bus effective. Base clock has been 100 megahertz since the Core I series. 133 on Nehalem for quite a while, but that died as well. It went to a straight 100 megahertz. However, the board now treats it differently too, but that's another story for another time and a bit more research on my part. Leadership. No. Yes, I'm aware I will use that joke constantly, but I'm a Stargate fan, and I'm a David Hewitt fan specifically because of that. Rodney McKay was a wonderful character, and though my wife hates him, I am him to a certain extent. I just don't do that. But yes. Anywho, as you keep going, you reach the end of life for DDR3, which ended with, I believe it was Broadwell, the 5th generation Core I whatever series. After that, they went DDR4, Skylake. Skylake was the really fun one, because at this point there's also what they call the process node, and this was slowly the internal structure of the chip inside, or the die. You're able to shrink down how fine you've got those wires and the transistors inside, so you get billions and billions of transistors. In fact, first time a chip received 1 billion transistors was, for those people who remember, 3DFX. I believe it was the Voodoo 5, no. I think it was the Voodoo 3 was the first billion transistor. I could be wrong. It might have been the 5, but Needless to say, yeah, I'm old. Because 3DFX doesn't exist. It was bought by NVIDIA. Not better. You'll find me saying that quite frequently. Yeah. um, but as Intel was stagnating, Intel or AMD was learning. And after the abomination that was Bulldozer, and then later, I believe it was Pile Driver, Excavator never actually happened properly. But we move on to socket AM4, and we get off of the other, which they did have another socket that was called FM1, and then later FM2, which one of the innovations with the mainstream I-series. So from it would be the i7, I think 8070 or 870, was the introduction of a GPU into the processor. So instead of it being a component of the motherboard, your video was now part of your CPU. And AMD said, we got you there. We bought a graphics company. FM1 and I believe it was 2 L's for llama. Yeah, FM1 was an interesting critter because it took the concept of budget gaming and flipped it. You didn't have to buy the graphics card anymore. It was baked into your CPU. And instead of being a graphics that was good enough, it was good enough to game a little. But it's still part of your RAM. So FM2 and FM2 Plus actually used parts of Bulldozer effectively. They weren't that great. On the cache, they were not as good as the FX series, but including that video made it a wonderful idea for if you just couldn't afford a graphics card, you now had a CPU that could do it. Granted, you probably were topping out at medium settings. You were never going to high. But low and medium, you could play your game quite well. And that was your A series AMD. So your A6, A8, A10, A12, which this moved on to AM4. And they decided to ditch 2 sockets. Good idea. Actually made it a wonderful idea. Though your mainstream enthusiast is now all on one platform now. It's just dollar amount. How much do you want to pay? You now have a wonderful chip that could do decent low end. It's cheap. But Intel ain't worried. Because they know they have power in the CPU, even if their video is good enough for maybe office work. Unless you're doing spreadsheets, you want a little bit more oomph. I have learned that one. Excel is a beast. But, let's see. Yeah, A-series. 5400, this would be an FM2. And the pins on the back are a little different. Now, along with that A-series, AMD has been cooking in the background. And they did something amazing. Because they became the underdog again. Intel was going, whatever. Ryzen. This I actually returned back to AMD for. This one in particular is one of their with graphics variations. It is the 2400 GE, so this is the low powered with graphics. It's a Ryzen 5, so that means it's got 4 cores and I think 8 threads. It did not outperform Haswell. That's twice. Did not outperform Skylake, but it made him take notice. When Ryzen first released, you're doing there's the R3, which is your low end, your R5, which is your mid-range to mainstream, and your R7, which is your performance level. If you notice something, i3, i5, i7, yeah, AMD, you lack originality in your naming. However, Bulldozer went up to that 8370, 8390, even a 9590, I believe. You can correct me on that one if I'm wrong. Or verify I'm right. Feel free to comment. Engagement's supposed to be a good thing on these channels. Yeah. But you went R7 1700. But if you looked at the Phenom days, they weren't the greatest chips, but they were still good. But that topped out at 1100 for the 6-core variation. It's kind of like AMD went, forget FX. We're trying to. We're taking some heavy medication and going to counseling. That, I think it was the 1800 on the R7s that made Intel go, hang on, what was that? I heard a noise. It was AMD's first DDR4. Intel kept it steady, and ironically, its processing node of 14 nanometer, which I think started with Broadwell, and they carried it over to Skylake with 14 plus. They went to the 7th generation, which was Kaby Lake, 14 plus plus. Coffee Lake for the 8th generation, 14 plus plus plus. You see where this is going. Intel's got a thing about 14, and that'll come up again in a few minutes. As they took notice, they didn't do anything. They sat on their 7% performance increase. So you get the next generation. AMD had some stability issues. Take it from an early adopter. My motherboard is sitting right there. BIOS update hell. Because almost every week there was a new revision, which improved stability, which broke some things, which fixed some others, which broke some of the fixes, which fixed some of the breaks that broke these others. Yeah. But the faster your RAM was, the more oomph it gave you. But overclocking wasn't the thing anymore. AMD kind of went as close to the bar as possible, so you didn't get that overhead that you can overclock to. And the stability wasn't there anyway. Now, on the next generation, instead of going to the 2800, they capped at the 27, which is actually what I've got on that board. There is a Ryzen R7 2700 up there, which unfortunately died. Yeah, the mining that you see, yes, I will point to, well, where I see it and you see it are two different places. Here, let me move my head, and now you can see another one. So I've got mining over here, here. Mirrors give me issues. I think I'm from that side. Anyhow, before I get any more distractions, I know there's more coming. I'm fine. That should not have been that natural. Anyhow, by the time you hit 3rd gen Ryzen, Intel done fucked up, and they know it. The 4th generation was laptops first. And they didn't do a whole lot, so they made it look like they skipped it. Now, here's the funny thing. That chip I showed you first, the 2400 GE, that's a 1st gen Ryzen with an APU. For some strange reason, the APUs, or Advanced Processing Unit, which has a GPU or Graphics Processing Unit installed into the chip, got a higher number. Yeah, I don't know either. Zen 1, which was the main architecture, was the 1000 series or the 2000 series on the APUs. 1.5, which they made a whole bunch of revisions to, was your 2000 series or 3000 series on the APUs. Zen 2, or the 3000 series, when Intel realized they'd done fucked up and had to start scrambling to fix things because AMD was catching up. AMD kept going. Oh yes. By the time you hit the 5000 series, you now have this additional thing called X3D. Remember that cache RAM I mentioned? Well, on the 3000 series, the cache went from either 8 or 16 megs to 32. On the X3D, they stuck another 32 on there. So 64 megs. Yeah, you had a lot more room to do, like, or the chip to do its instructions and whatnot. And the cache meant more. Intel for a long time would not exceed 8. And in a lot of cases, their i7s and i5s had 6. Mind you, it was a level 1, which had like kilobytes here, a level 2 that had a meg here, and L3 that had 6 here. That was that thing about Bulldozer versus the A series. Bulldozer had the L3, which was usually like 8 megs, which was the plateau for some stupid reason. And the A series had 4 megs on the L2. So you'd have like 3 megs here, 8 megs there, 11. I can't believe that never didn't work. They just implemented it wrong. But yeah, the X3D chips, when it came to gaming, that R7 5800 X3D is a powerhouse. Only has 8 cores, but each of those cores has 2 threads, so 16 threads. Yeah. Behind me, the system that is running, the one to that side, that's an R9 3900 with that nice 32 megs of cache, and mine's really freaking well. My main gaming system that's in the bedroom is a R9 7900X. I believe that one has 64 megs of cache, but don't hold me to that. I might look it up later on. Yeah. If you want power, it's back to AMD. In the most recent developments, remember I said Intel has a problem with 14. When they got to the 13th gen, I don't remember the name to that one, unfortunately, they started having problem with the silicon. They had oxidation and power issues because they were trying to push it so hard to keep up their, to keep the performance crown from AMD. They were pushing it so hard that they were pushing voltage to unrealistic levels. And come the 14th gen, they had the same problems. That's why they had their recalls. Oxidation in the silicon, so your copper was probably turning green. And high voltage through that same. To quote Electric Six, danger, danger, high voltage. Yeah, and it wasn't just when they kissed. It was all the damn time. When they were trying to reach the above 5 gigahertz, they were pushing so much voltage that they were ruining their own chips. They did, later on, put out what's called microcode, which goes into the BIOS of the motherboards, that the microcode says this is what the CPU can do and shouldn't do. Don't exceed these limits. And if you got your chip and your motherboard after those, and you got the BIOS put in, and you don't push to those limits, you might have a good chip. If you did it beforehand, you were playing the lotto. Unfortunately. I'm sorry to those of you who failed the lotto. You were failed by Intel. I hope your warranties were upheld. What's a CPU? A pain. Unfortunately, the 14th gen is where Intel decided, okay, we're done with this series. The Core i series is done. Now we're doing the Core series. Didn't you do that already? You had Core 2. You had the Core Solo, Core Duo, Core 2 Solo, Core 2 Duo, Core 2 Quad. The Core's been done. I guess naming is not at the core of your being. Yeah. So you've got the and it gets better because you have the Core 3, the Core 5, Core 5 Ultra, Core 7, Core 7 Ultra, and I think Core 9 and Core 9 Ultra. Don't hold me accountable to that one, but they were doing it for others, so hey, why not? So that's a very simplified. Ow. Okay. That's a rambled simplification of the history of the CPU from at least the 386 to present day. If you want the top end CPU, currently, as of time of filming, the Ryzen R7 9800 X3D is your top performer. For production, it's the R9 9950 X3D. The X3D means it has more cache on it. They actually put where, if you look at the chip, it's kind of like a single plane. The X3D means they discovered there's a third axis. There's an up and down. On the 7000 series, they put the cache above. On the 9000 series, they put the cache underneath. The 8000 series is your APU range in that case. Even though every every 7000 series except for an F variant has a dumbed down GPU baked in. Wait for the new generation to come out. They're getting better. AMD doesn't want to put a high graphics core amount in initially because they don't want to disrupt the GPU market. Yeah, anybody else hear the joke there? Unfortunately, that's real. So, that might give you a good idea of the history. If you're going out and buying one, and you stayed awake long enough to get to this part, I'm sorry it took, oh God, I'm almost at 2 hours. I'm sorry that it took me this long to ramble to this point. What's the best out there? What's the best for you? I'm sorry to say it is down to that. I am a big fan of AMD because they were the underdogs and I was an outcast. I barely fit in with other outcasts, so underdogs are a good thing. They force change in the status quo. Actually, it comes down to a concept of what is a monster? A monster is change. What is an underdog? A monster, essentially. I'm proud to be a monster. I'm not getting into pronouns. Now, if you want to go Intel, I would say, like, because of prices today, 12th generation is probably your best bet, even though it is like 3, 4, 5, really? No, 3, 4 years. More so because it doesn't have the voltage and oxidation problems. Hopefully by this point, the 13th gen and 14th gen chips have been discovered and returned to Intel, because you still have a chance otherwise of finding them. And that could make a bad day. Outside of that, they're still decent. Just make sure you update your BIOS before you play your games or before you mess with the clock settings. On AMD, don't mess with the clock settings. It does it on its own. The boost can do more than just like 1 or 2 cores. Actually, it can do a range of them. And there's no point anymore. At least unless you're doing an overclocking competition, then okay. I'll concede that one. Your CPU is the computer's brain. Think of how yours works. Realize time degrades. Voltage does the same thing. Voltage is your time. The more voltage you put through, the less time you'll have. Undervolting, reducing the voltage that it can take, but making sure it's still stable, will actually increase the lifespan. But I might actually save that for a what is overclocking video, and hopefully it doesn't get like this. I won't do that much of a history lesson thing. Whew. God dang. If you stayed with this, you're patient. Wow. How the hell did you pull that off? I guaranteed I'd have looked at the time frame of how long this is going, and I've said, no. So, if you stayed, thank you. If you liked, yeah. If you didn't like, okay, I'll admit it. I rambled for way too freaking long. If, say, you found this helpful, let me know. Comments are welcome. I may not respond right away, but as long as the number is low enough, I will respond to as many of you as I can. Granted, like I said, I don't check right away. The computer that this is actually recorded on is checked periodically, but not constantly. The system I usually game on is in another room. That's usually the one I'm on. So the one that I'm on right now is actually set up specifically for this. It's also a Xeon. If anybody wanted to know, it's a Skylake based Xeon. So 6th gen, 14 plus. I'm fine. Yeah. Well, if this actually seems helpful enough, share it. I was shocked as hell when I saw the figures for my last video. It had more views than all my other videos put together. Woohoo! I'm getting somewhere. This one, I can see a drop off because, yeah, I went kind of long. This may actually take some time to upload. But until next time, when hopefully I don't ramble nearly as much. Well, as a great man once said, keep your stick on the ice. Until next time I see you, fare thee well.